A successful black businesswoman walks into National Bank, expecting a routine loan approval. But things don't go as planned. She faces blatant discrimination from a white manager who makes her wait for hours, treating her as if she doesn't belong. What he doesn't realize is that she's the CEO of a multi-million-dollar real estate company and a friend of one of the bank's board members. Maya Johnson stepped out of her black luxury sedan, adjusting the cuffs of her sharp charcoal blazer as she took in the imposing sight of Summit National Bank. The grand structure, with its gleaming glass facade and towering white columns, was a beacon of corporate prestige, a place where high-stakes deals were made, fortunes were secured, and power was brokered over the course of a single signature. But Maya knew all too well that power was not evenly distributed, not in banks, not in boardrooms, and certainly not in the world of real estate, where she had fought tooth and nail to carve out a space for herself. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked confidently through the revolving doors, the soft click of her heels against the polished marble floor echoing through the expansive lobby. Her presence turned a few heads, not because she was unfamiliar, but because a black woman dressed with the effortless authority of a CEO was still an anomaly in spaces like these. She didn't need their approval. She had long since stopped caring whether rooms like this welcomed her. She had earned the right to be here, and today she was here for business. Maya had built legacy developments from the ground up, defying every roadblock placed in her way. Her latest project, the Westbrook Heights Initiative, was poised to be a game-changer, a sustainable, affordable housing development designed to uplift the very neighborhood she had grown up in, transforming neglected lots into modern, dignified homes for families who deserved better. The only thing left to finalize was this loan. Every financial metric was in her favor: pristine credit, impeccable business records, millions in assets under management. This wasn't a gamble. This was a sure thing. She approached the reception desk, where a young bank teller with a neat bun and a Navy Summit National uniform sat behind a sleek, modern counter. The woman's name tag read Jessica. Maya offered a polite, confident smile. "Good morning. My name is Maya Johnson. I have a 10 a.m. appointment with Mr. Richard Coleman." Jessica glanced up from her screen, her smile faltering ever so slightly as she processed the name. It was a fleeting hesitation, the kind that would have been imperceptible to anyone who hadn't encountered it 1,000 times before. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, and after a few moments she nodded. "Of course, Ms. Johnson. Please have a seat. I'll let Mr. Coleman know you've arrived." Maya thanked her and turned toward the seating area, settling into one of the sleek leather chairs arranged in a precise semicircle around a low, glass coffee table. The digital clock on the lobby wall read 9:55, right on time. She pulled out her phone and began reviewing her notes, her focus sharp. This was merely a formality, a simple closing meeting to sign off on what had already been approved. The minutes ticked by. At 10:10 a.m., Maya glanced up from her screen, noticing Jessica whispering to a colleague at the desk. There was a nervous shift in the way their eyes darted toward her before quickly looking away. A familiar tightness settled in Maya's chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had been in these situations before. Patience was a game she had learned to master. At 10:30 a.m., she decided to inquire. Rising from her seat, she walked back to the desk, her heels clicking steadily. Her voice was firm, professional, but unmistakably pointed. "Excuse me, I just wanted to confirm, has Mr. Coleman been informed that I'm here?" Jessica's fingers hesitated on the keyboard before she nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am, he's aware. He's just finishing up some tasks. He'll be with you shortly." Maya gave a slow nod, her expression unreadable. She had built a multi-million-dollar business by recognizing when she was being given the runaround, but she also knew better than to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She returned to her seat, crossed her legs, checked her emails, observed. At 10:45 a.m., she watched as a middle-aged white man, dressed in khakis and a golf polo, approached the front desk. His conversation with Jessica lasted less than a minute before a senior banking associate, not just a teller, but a higher-ranking staff member, emerged from an office to shake his hand and lead him inside. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. Maya's jaw tightened, but her face remained carefully neutral. She tapped her phone screen, noting the time. 11 a.m. Enough. She stood again, this time her voice carrying a sharper edge. "It's been over an hour past my appointment time. I'd like to know what's causing the delay." Jessica swallowed hard, looking genuinely uncomfortable now. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Johnson. Let me check again." She picked up the phone, her voice low as she spoke into the receiver. A quiet exchange followed. Then she set the phone down with a nervous glance. "Mr. Coleman will be out shortly." Maya gave a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She waited another 30 minutes. At 11:45 a.m., the doors to the executive offices finally swung open and Richard Coleman appeared. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a navy blue suit tailored within an inch of perfection. Everything about his demeanor exuded confidence, the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having had to justify his presence in rooms like this. His smile was thin, perfunctory, the kind of smile given out of obligation rather than genuine courtesy. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his tone smooth, practiced, "I apologize for the wait. We've been incredibly busy this morning." Maya didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let him off the hook so easily. "I had a 10 a.m. appointment," she said, clear and direct, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It's now 11:45. I'd appreciate it if we could proceed." A flicker of something passed through Coleman's expression: annoyance. Discomfort? Before he recovered, gesturing toward the hallway. "Of course," he said, a bit too quickly. "Right this way." As they walked past the teller stations, Maya felt the weight of the glances exchanged behind her back, the silent acknowledgement from employees who had seen everything unfold, but said nothing. Once inside his office, Coleman motioned toward a chair before settling into his own, but he took his time adjusting papers, clicking his mouse, acting as if Maya had nothing better to do than wait on him a little longer. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Now," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "what can I do for you today, Ms. Johnson?" Maya's smile was razor-sharp. "I believe you already know," she said, her voice smooth as glass. This was not going to go the way he thought it would. Richard Coleman's lips curled into a thin smile, the kind that barely concealed his irritation, the kind of smile that said he thought he was in control. He leaned back in his chair, exuding a studied nonchalance, fingers tapping idly against the polished wood of his desk. "Ah, yes," he drawled, as if only now remembering. "The Westbrook Heights Initiative. Quite the undertaking." He clicked his mouse a few times, eyes skimming across his monitor, though Maya knew he was stalling. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't so much as adjust in her seat. She had spent nearly 2 hours being treated as an afterthought. She would give him nothing now, not the satisfaction of seeing her shift uncomfortably, not even the courtesy of making his job easier. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, thick and heavy, until Coleman finally cleared his throat and continued. "I see the preliminary approvals here," he said, voice deliberate, each word measured as if he were doing her a personal favor. "But you understand these things take time. Loans of this size, particularly for projects of this scale, require extensive due diligence. I like to take a personal look at the numbers before signing off." Maya tilted her head just slightly, studying him. She had been in this game too long not to recognize what this was. This was a power play. A deliberate delay. A test to see if she would flinch, if she would back down, if she would grow frustrated enough to make a mistake, say the wrong thing, react emotionally, give him an excuse to bury her in bureaucracy. She exhaled slowly through her nose, keeping her voice smooth. "Mr. Coleman, the underwriting team has already conducted their review. Every financial metric meets or exceeds your institution's lending criteria. This is not an application in process. This is an approval pending only your signature." She let that hang in the air for a beat before adding, "Unless, of course, there's another reason for the delay." His smile faltered, just barely. "Of course not," he said, a touch too quickly, before regaining his composure. "But you have to understand, Ms. Johnson, that we take our responsibilities seriously. A multi-million-dollar loan isn't something we hand out lightly." "Nor should it be," Maya replied, her voice even, controlled. "Which is why I came prepared. My firm has already secured commitments from investors. The financials have been reviewed, verified, and approved. The only remaining step," she met his gaze without hesitation, "is your signature." So if there's an issue, I'd like to hear it now. Coleman reclined slightly, expression unreadable. Then he gave a small chuckle, as if amused. You're a very direct woman, Ms. Johnson. Maya didn't smile. That tends to happen when you spend 2 hours being ignored. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, something akin to annoyance, but she saw it for what it really was. Discomfort. Because she had named the thing neither of them had acknowledged. He had made her wait. Not because he was busy. Not because of due diligence. Because he could. And now she was calling him on it. Coleman cleared his throat again, shifting in his seat. Well, he said, turning back to his screen. As I said, I just want to take one last look. Then, without another word, he began clicking through her documents, skimming through spreadsheets and financial statements as if he hadn't already had them for weeks. Maya watched him, unblinking, as he scrolled at a pace that suggested he wasn't actually reading anything at all. This wasn't about reviewing numbers. This was about making her wait. Again. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Every so often, he would ask a question, one that had already been answered in the paperwork, one so basic that it was clear he was looking for a reason to find something wrong. Maya responded to each inquiry with crisp, precise answers, her patience unshaken. If he thought he could break her, if he thought she would lose her temper and give him a reason to push her aside, he was mistaken. By the time the clock struck 12:45, Maya had reached her limit. She stood abruptly, the motion sharp and deliberate, forcing Coleman to look up in surprise. Mr. Coleman, she said, her voice still calm, still measured, but now laced with unmistakable finality, I value professionalism and respect, and I expect the same from those I do business with. If there is an actual issue with my application, I would appreciate you stating it clearly. Otherwise, I believe we've wasted enough time. Coleman blinked. The shift in power was immediate. She wasn't asking anymore. Before he could respond, a knock sounded at the office door. A junior employee, a young black woman with a nervous but determined expression, poked her head in. Excuse me, Mr. Coleman, she said, her voice carefully polite. The regional board members have just arrived for their meeting. Coleman's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His posture straightened. His fingers twitched as he smoothed down his tie. It was a subtle shift, but Maya saw it, the sudden urgency, the realization that his actions were about to have an audience he actually cared about. Right, he said quickly, clearing his throat as he rose to his feet. Of course. Please, show them to the conference room. I'll be there shortly. The employee hesitated, then added, one of the board members specifically asked to see Ms. Johnson before the meeting begins. Maya lifted an eyebrow, intrigued. Coleman's face drained of color. It was the most satisfaction Maya had felt all morning. Well, she said smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer, I suppose we shouldn't keep them waiting. She turned and strode toward the door, her steps measured, deliberate, the steps of a woman who had just taken back control of the room. Behind her she could hear Coleman's hurried footsteps as he followed, his shoes clicking against the marble floors with the urgency of a man who knew he had just made a very costly mistake. As they entered the bank's main lobby, a quiet hum of conversation filled the space. Employees who had once watched Maya wait in silence now stole furtive glances as she passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to something closer to satisfaction, because even they knew what was about to happen. The doors to the executive conference room were open, revealing a cluster of impeccably dressed board members, their conversations low but engaged. And at the center of them stood Jonathan Harris, a tall, silver-haired man with the kind of commanding presence that could shift the air in a room without saying a word. When he spotted Maya, his face broke into a warm, genuine smile. Maya, he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. It's been too long. A murmur of curiosity passed through the other board members. Clearly, they had not expected this level of familiarity. Coleman, standing just behind Maya, looked as though he wanted to disappear into the floor. Maya smiled, a real smile this time. Jonathan, she greeted, stepping forward, it certainly has. And just like that, the balance of power shifted completely. Jonathan Harris extended a firm hand, his presence commanding but warm, the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. Maya accepted the handshake without hesitation, her grip just as steady, just as sure. Around them, the other board members exchanged curious glances, their interest piqued by the familiarity between them. Richard Coleman, standing slightly behind Maya, looked as though he had just swallowed a mouthful of sand. His posture was stiff, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, the polished confidence he had wielded so freely in his office, now visibly cracking under the weight of the situation. Jonathan gestured toward the seating area at the far end of the conference room. "Please, Maya, join us. We were just discussing some of the bank's upcoming initiatives, and I'd love to hear your insights." His tone was casual, friendly, but the underlying implication was clear. She belonged in this conversation, and her voice carried weight here. Maya smiled, adjusting the strap of her handbag as she moved toward the long glass table. "I'd be happy to," she said smoothly. She didn't spare Coleman a glance, but she didn't need to. His discomfort was palpable, thick in the air between them. The shift in power had happened so quickly, so effortlessly, that he hadn't even had time to fight against it. The board members took their seats, their eyes flickering between Maya and Coleman, clearly trying to piece together the dynamics at play. Jonathan, ever the strategist, wasted no time. "Before we begin, Richard," he said, turning to Coleman with an easy but pointed smile, "I trust everything has been going smoothly with Ms. Johnson's loan approval." Maya watched as Coleman's throat bobbed slightly, his discomfort deepening. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Of course," he said, his voice clipped. "We were just finalizing some of the last details." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. "Really?" he asked, his tone light but carrying a weight that made Coleman's fingers twitch against the edge of the table. "Because I seem to recall that Ms. Johnson had a 10 o'clock appointment, and unless my watch is broken," he glanced at his expensive timepiece before looking up again. "It's nearly 1 o'clock." A murmur rippled through the room, small but unmistakable. Coleman went pale. His mouth opened, then closed again, as if scrambling for the right words. "Well," he started, his voice thinner now, less certain. "As I said, I was simply ensuring due diligence was followed. A project of this magnitude requires a level of scrutiny that your team had already completed," Maya interjected smoothly, turning to face the board. Her tone was measured, professional, not emotional, but precise. "Summit National Bank has already approved my application at every level. My financials have been reviewed, my investors vetted, my assets assessed. Today was meant to be a final sign-off, not another review process. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear, I was made to wait nearly 3 hours while other clients were seen immediately." She let her words settle, allowing them to fully register before adding, "So I would also be interested in hearing Mr. Coleman's explanation." The weight of the room shifted. Coleman's carefully constructed authority crumbled right before their eyes. Jonathan folded his hands in front of him, tilting his head slightly. "That's a good question," he mused. "Richard, why exactly was Ms. Johnson made to wait?" Coleman was trapped, and he knew it. He tried to recover, shifting in his seat as his lips pressed into a thin line. "As I mentioned," he repeated, his voice strained, "I was conducting a thorough final review to ensure." "Would you have conducted the same final review if I had been someone else?" Maya asked, her voice deceptively calm. "If I had walked in here looking different? Or if my last name had been, say, Kensington or Whitmore?" The silence that followed was deafening. A flicker of something crossed Coleman's face. Anger? Guilt? It was impossible to tell. But for the first time that morning, he had no scripted response to hide behind. Jonathan's expression darkened, his usual easy demeanor giving way to something far sharper. "Richard," he said evenly, "I trust you understand how serious this is." Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Harris, I assure you, I treat all of our clients with equal." "Do you?" Jonathan cut him off, his voice carrying a dangerous edge now. "Because from where I'm sitting, that doesn't seem to be the case. And I have to wonder." He turned his gaze to the other board members, his eyes scanning the room. "If Ms. Johnson, an established entrepreneur with a sterling track record, was subjected to this kind of treatment, how many others have experienced the same, but didn't have the platform to address it?" A few of the board members exchanged looks. A couple of them sat up straighter. The shift was subtle, but the implications were anything but. Coleman's jaw tightened, his hands clasping together in an attempt to keep them from visibly trembling. I. Jonathan didn't wait for his excuse. Miss Johnson, he said, turning back to Maya with an easy smile, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced today. That is not the standard we hold at this institution. And moving forward, I'll personally ensure your loan is processed without further delay. Maya met his gaze and held it. Then, slowly, she nodded. I appreciate that, she said, her voice steady. But I also believe this conversation shouldn't end with just me. I'd like to know what steps the bank intends to take to ensure no other client has to experience this kind of unnecessary obstruction. Jonathan's smile widened, as if he had been waiting for her to ask exactly that. I'm glad you said that, he replied, because we were just discussing some adjustments to our customer service policies. And, if you're open to it, I'd like to invite you to consult with us on that initiative. There's no one better suited to help us ensure that Summit National Bank operates at the standard we claim to uphold. Maya tilted her head, considering. I'd be happy to, she said finally. Coleman looked physically ill. Jonathan stood, signaling the conversation was over. Well then, he said, reaching out to shake Maya's hand, let's get to work. And just like that, Coleman wasn't a factor anymore. He had been made irrelevant in his own boardroom. Maya shook Jonathan's hand, then turned toward the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught the eye of the young junior employee, the one who had spoken up earlier. The woman offered a small nod, respect flickering in her gaze. Maya returned it, then strode toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She had come here expecting to finalize a loan. She was leaving with something much bigger. As Maya stepped out of the boardroom, the tension in the air lingered like the fading echo of a storm. The hushed murmurs of bank employees rippled through the marble-lined corridors, their stolen glances flickering between curiosity and quiet approval. It was clear that word had already spread about the woman who had walked in with authority, waited nearly 3 hours in silent defiance, and then dismantled Richard Coleman's position in the span of a single conversation. She adjusted the strap of her handbag, her mind already pivoting to the next step. This wasn't just about the loan anymore. It was about leveraging this moment into something bigger, something that lasted beyond this boardroom, beyond her personal victory. A voice called after her, steady and deliberate. Ms. Johnson, a moment? Maya turned to find Jonathan Harris striding up beside her, his expression unreadable, though his gaze held the sharpness of someone who had just witnessed a shift in power and was already considering the ramifications. His walk was purposeful, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his tailored navy suit, the presence of a man who understood influence and knew how to wield it. She stopped but didn't fully turn toward him, keeping her posture relaxed but her stance firm. Jonathan, she greeted, her tone even. Something else on your mind? He gave a small smile, one that hinted at amusement but was layered with something deeper: calculation, opportunity, recognition. I wanted to personally thank you, he said, glancing briefly around the lobby before lowering his voice slightly. Not just for your patience today, but for handling the situation with the kind of poise most people wouldn't have mustered after an experience like that. Maya's expression didn't change, but she read between the lines immediately. He wasn't just acknowledging her professionalism, he was acknowledging what he had just witnessed, the unspoken truth of how power played out differently for people who looked like her. I appreciate that, Jonathan, she said smoothly, tilting her head slightly. Though I have to say, patience wasn't exactly my first choice. It was just the most strategic one. A low chuckle escaped him, a genuine flicker of respect passing between them. Fair enough, he conceded, nodding. Then, after a pause, his expression turned serious. You asked earlier what steps the bank intended to take to prevent this from happening again. I wasn't exaggerating when I said we're making changes. This isn't just about damage control, this is about correcting a systemic issue before it becomes a liability too large to ignore. Maya studied him for a moment, considering his words. She had spent enough time navigating boardrooms and financial institutions to know that real change didn't happen just because people suddenly developed a conscience. It happened because the risk of not changing became greater than the risk of staying the same. And Jonathan Harris, for all his charm and influence, was a man who understood risk better than most. You're right, she said finally. It is a liability, and if Summit National wants to position itself as a leader in equitable banking, it's going to take more than a few policy changes and a PR statement. That's why I want you in the room, Jonathan replied without hesitation. We're forming an internal task force to overhaul customer service policies, everything from loan processing to executive training on implicit bias. I want you advising on it. Not just for optics, but because you understand where the cracks in the system are. Maya arched a brow. And what makes you think I have the time for that? Jonathan smirked, shaking his head. Because you're standing here having this conversation with me instead of walking out that door. She exhaled through her nose, amused despite herself. He wasn't wrong. She hadn't come here looking for this fight, but now that it had landed at her feet, she wasn't the type to walk away from it. You're asking me to help fix a system I didn't break, she said, her tone unreadable. I'm asking you to make sure we don't break it any further, Jonathan countered. She let that sit between them for a moment, the weight of it pressing against the space where her frustration had been simmering since she first walked into this building hours ago. Finally, she gave a slow nod. All right, she said. I'll sit in. But if I get the sense that this is just another empty initiative designed to save face rather than create actual change, I won't waste my time. Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. That's exactly why I want you involved. Maya extended her hand. Then it's settled. He took it, shaking firmly. As she finally turned to leave, a voice called her name softly. She glanced over her shoulder to find the young junior employee, the same one who had first intervened when Coleman was stalling, standing near the teller counters, looking hesitant but determined. Miss Johnson, the woman said quickly, taking a small step forward. I just wanted to say I saw what happened today, and she hesitated, then straightened slightly. I just wanted to thank you for saying something, for not letting it slide. Maya's expression softened just slightly. This was why she had pushed back. Not just for herself, but for the ones who didn't always have the power to do the same. She walked back toward the young woman, lowering her voice slightly. What's your name? Aaron, the woman answered. Well, Aaron, Maya said, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, you're the reason this changes. Aaron blinked, momentarily taken aback. Me? Maya nodded. You spoke up. You made sure I wasn't sitting in that office all afternoon. And that matters. Aaron's eyes flickered with something, a mix of gratitude and realization. Thank you, she murmured, her voice quieter this time. Maya gave her a final nod before finally stepping toward the exit. As she pushed open the heavy glass doors, the warm afternoon air rushed to greet her, and she felt lighter, but not finished. This wasn't just about her loan, her experience, or even this bank. It was about something much larger. As she slid into the back seat of her car, she pulled out her phone and began drafting an email to her team. This wasn't just going to be a story about what she endured today. It was going to be the first step towards something far bigger. Maya's car moved smoothly through the bustling streets of downtown, the city humming with the energy of midday commerce. The weight of the morning still clung to her, but it wasn't exhaustion, it was something sharper, something electric. Her phone buzzed against her palm, the email she had been drafting momentarily forgotten as a familiar name lit up her screen. Michael Carter. She smirked slightly, answering on the second ring. You must have a sixth sense for when I'm about to shake up an entire institution. Michael's chuckle was low and knowing. I caught wind of something happening at Summit National. Let me guess you walked in for a routine meeting and ended up restructuring their whole damn system. Maya exhaled through her nose, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Something like that. Michael had been her right-hand strategist since Legacy Developments had been nothing more than a scrappy startup with a big vision and too many doors slammed in its face. He had an uncanny ability to anticipate battles before they happened, and his instincts were rarely wrong. I assume the loan's approved, he continued, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Not just approved. Expedited, she confirmed, shifting slightly in her seat as the car pulled up to a red light. And I've been invited to consult on a new task force at the bank. They're overhauling their internal policies, and apparently, I'm the best person to tell them where they've been screwing up. Michael let out a low whistle. Damn. They really fumbled this one, huh? They did. Maya agreed, her tone measured. But now I have a seat at the table. And you know what they say, once you get inside, you don't just sit quietly. Michael's laughter was warm, but there was an edge of something else in it, recognition, maybe even reverence. You planning on making them regret that invitation? Maya tapped her fingers lightly against her knee, considering. I plan on making them change, whether they regret it or not. The light turned green, and her driver eased the car forward, the familiar skyline stretching ahead. As they approached Legacy Development's headquarters, the energy inside her shifted again. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement, and she had every intention of making it count. I'll see you in 10, she told Michael, ending the call just as the car rolled to a stop in front of her office building. Stepping out, she adjusted her blazer and strode through the glass doors, nodding at the receptionist before heading straight for the executive conference room. Her team was already gathered, the air buzzing with anticipation. Seated at the long oak table were the people who would help build Legacy from the ground up: financial analysts, project managers, architects, and community liaisons, all of whom had dedicated themselves to rewriting the rules of real estate. And at the head of the table, waiting with an expectant look, was Michael. All right, he said, folding his hands in front of him. Let's hear it. How bad was it? Maya placed her phone on the table and exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Bad enough that if I had walked out and never looked back, no one in that building would have batted an eye. Bad enough that if I hadn't had the right connections, I'd still be waiting in that damn lobby. A murmur rippled through the room, some shaking their heads, others exchanging looks that carried a deep, shared understanding. But, she continued, straightening, it was also bad enough that it forced a reckoning. That bank is being forced to look itself in the mirror today, and for the first time, they're actually afraid of what they see. Michael leaned back slightly, studying her. And they want you to help fix their reflection. Maya smirked. They don't have a choice. A chuckle rolled through the room, but it was underscored with something more serious, something heavier. Because this wasn't new, they all knew what it meant to be in spaces that weren't built for them. Spaces that actively worked against them, even when they played by the rules. So what's the next move? One of her project managers, Nia Washington, asked, her brow furrowed. Are we talking about real change, or is this just another PR stunt to calm the fire until they think everyone's forgotten? Maya's fingers drummed lightly against the table, her mind already working through the angles. That depends on us, she admitted. If we do this right, if we force them to follow through, we could set a precedent for how major banks handle minority-owned businesses and community investment. We could push for policies that actually have weight protections against predatory lending, increased transparency in loan processing, real accountability in how these decisions are made. Michael nodded slowly. And if they try to stall? If this turns out to be just another corporate showpiece? Maya met his gaze without hesitation. Then we make them regret ever inviting us in. Silence followed for a beat, then a slow, collective nod passed through the team. They had been here before. They knew what it meant to fight, and they knew exactly how much was at stake. All right, Michael said, tapping his pen against the table. Then let's not waste any time. If Summit National wants to pretend they're leading this conversation, let's make sure they actually have to. The room came alive, laptops opening, notes being passed, conversations breaking out into actionable plans. Maya sat back for a moment, letting the momentum build around her. This wasn't just about what had happened to her today. This was about making sure it didn't happen to the next person. And that was a battle she had every intention of winning. The following week, Maya Johnson walked back into Summit National Bank, but this time she wasn't coming in as a client hoping for fair treatment. She was coming in as a force of accountability. The bank's boardroom, usually a space filled with comfortable complacency, was now a site of quiet tension. The members of the newly formed Equity and Inclusion Task Force, a mix of executives, senior loan officers, and legal advisors, sat around the long, polished mahogany table, their postures varying between professional composure and thinly veiled unease. Maya took her seat without hesitation, her presence commanding in a way that required no arrogance, just certainty. Jonathan Harris, seated at the head of the table, nodded in acknowledgement, but the same sharp attentiveness in his eyes told her that he knew as well as she did this wasn't just a meeting. This was a reckoning. Across from her, Richard Coleman sat stiffly, noticeably subdued compared to the dismissive arrogance he had wielded just a week ago. He hadn't been fired, but it was clear his power had been clipped, his influence diminished. Maya didn't bother looking his way. He was no longer relevant. Jonathan cleared his throat, straightening in his seat. All right, let's get started. This task force exists because Summit National can't afford to operate in the dark anymore. We're here to address systemic failures, starting with loan discrimination and how clients, particularly minority-owned businesses, are being handled within this institution. Maya, I want to start with you. You had a first-hand experience with this issue. What do you believe needs to change? Maya folded her hands in front of her, letting the silence settle before she spoke. Let's be clear, she began, her voice smooth, unwavering. The problem isn't just what happened to me. It's what's been happening for years to countless others who didn't have the leverage to push back. It's about the people who never got past the front desk, the entrepreneurs who walked in with solid business plans and left with nothing because some loan officer decided they weren't worth the risk. It's about an entire system designed to function just enough in the shadows that no one can prove what's happening, even though everyone knows it is. A silence followed, heavier this time. One of the executives, a man in a tailored gray suit who had introduced himself earlier as Daniel Prescott, Chief Compliance Officer, adjusted his tie, shifting slightly in his seat. Ms. Johnson, I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree that there are challenges we need to address. But banking regulations are already in place to prevent this sort of discrimination. We have compliance audits, risk assessments. And yet, somehow, I still sat in your lobby for 3 hours, Maya cut in smoothly. So let's not pretend policies alone solve anything. Bias doesn't exist in policy. It exists in people. In the decisions made behind closed doors, in the assumptions that go unchecked because no one is holding anyone accountable. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, satisfaction, perhaps, that Maya was willing to say what no one else in this room would dare to. Prescott exhaled, nodding slowly, as if accepting that this conversation wouldn't be as neatly contained as he'd hoped. So what do you propose? He asked. Maya tapped her fingers lightly against the table, her voice firm but controlled. Real oversight. Transparent tracking of loan approvals and rejections, broken down by race, gender, and business type. A system that flags disproportionate denials for further review. And she shifted her gaze toward the senior loan officers, her next words aimed directly at them. A clear accountability structure for loan officers who consistently deny qualified applicants without just cause. A ripple of discomfort spread across the room. One of the loan executives, a woman with sharp features and dark auburn hair, Olivia Bennett, finally spoke, her voice careful. That's a bold proposition, Ms. Johnson. You're essentially suggesting that we create a system that tracks individual lending decisions and audits them for bias. That could be interpreted as micromanagement. Maya met her gaze without hesitation. And what you're describing as micromanagement, I call ensuring fairness. Because the truth is, without real oversight, nothing changes. Your bank can keep issuing PR statements about diversity and equity, but if black and brown entrepreneurs are still being disproportionately denied loans, then those statements mean nothing. Jonathan exhaled, finally speaking again. Maya's right. If we want to prove we're serious about change, we can't just talk about equity. We have to show measurable progress. Otherwise, we're just protecting the problem instead of solving it. Maya caught the small flicker of resistance that passed through some of the executives, the barely perceptible shift in their postures. Of course they didn't like this. Change was easy to discuss in theory, but when it threatened their control, their unchecked authority, that was when the real battle began. Let's put this to a vote, Jonathan continued, looking around the table. If we're going to move forward with this level of transparency, we need full buy-in from leadership. One by one, hands raised. Some willingly, others hesitantly, a few after brief glances at their peers, but in the end the motion passed. Maya didn't smile. Not yet. This was only the beginning. Jonathan nodded, satisfied. Then we proceed. Maya, I want you involved at every stage of this rollout. You're not just consulting, you're shaping how this gets implemented. Maya inclined her head slightly. Then you'll get my unfiltered input. No half measures. No performative nonsense. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Jonathan replied. Richard Coleman remained silent throughout the entire exchange, his fingers laced tightly together, his jaw locked. Maya finally turned to look at him, taking in the barely concealed frustration in his posture. You don't seem to have much to say, Richard, she noted, her tone light but laced with something sharper. His lips pressed together before he finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. I'm here to follow whatever decisions are made by the board. Maya let out a soft hum. Good. Then I look forward to seeing how well you adapt to these new expectations. She didn't linger after that. The decision had been made, and she had no interest in wasting breath on men like Coleman anymore. Instead, she gathered her things, shook hands with Jonathan, and walked out of the boardroom, feeling the weight of what had just been set in motion. By the time she stepped back onto the streets of downtown, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows against the towering buildings. She exhaled slowly, pulling out her phone, and dialed Michael's number. He answered almost instantly. Tell me they folded. Maya smiled, the first genuine one she had allowed herself all day. They folded. Michael let out a low chuckle. And now, she said, pausing as she looked up at the towering glass building of Summit National, we make sure they follow through. She ended the call and slipped her phone into her pocket. The fight wasn't over. But today, she had forced the system to acknowledge its own cracks. And tomorrow, she would start making sure they never had the chance to ignore them again. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.